F.W. de Klerk. You hear that name, and to most of the world, he's a hero. He's the Nobel laureate, the last president of apartheid South Africa who somehow found the courage to tear down the very system he was supposed to protect. This is the man who freed Nelson Mandela, who stared into the abyss of a civil war and pulled his country back. But for millions of South Africans, his name brings up something else entirely. His presidency is remembered as a time of just unimaginable violence, of secret operations, and of a history that was deliberately, systematically erased, leaving behind scars that honestly have never really healed. To get to the truth, we have to look at both sides of the coin, starting with the hero the world thought it knew.
So picture this. It's February 2nd, 1990. De Klerk stands up in front of Parliament and says those words: "The time for negotiation has arrived." After decades of the most brutal repression, the leader of the racist National Party himself is saying the only way forward is peace. I mean, it was a political earthquake. It felt like a brand new day was dawning.
And for a while, everybody believed in the miracle. The story was just so simple, so powerful, right? One man chooses reason over racism, chooses the future over the past, and single-handedly saves his country. He was showered with awards, called a statesman, a visionary, the hero of a peaceful revolution. Now, to really understand just how deep this contradiction runs, we have to start with that hero story, because you can't deny it. The things he did on the world stage were absolutely massive.
And what's really wild is just how fast it all happened. I mean, within months of taking power, bam, he unbans the liberation movements like the ANC. He frees Nelson Mandela after 27 years in prison. He starts ripping up the very laws that held apartheid together, where you could live, who you could marry, all of it. And for all this, he ends up sharing the Nobel Peace Prize with the very man whose freedom he'd just granted.
It's a heck of a story that earned him praise from every corner of the globe. But it is only half the story. Because while the diplomats were clinking champagne glasses in Oslo, a totally different reality was playing out in the townships of South Africa. A reality of blood, of terror, and of a secret hidden war.
You see, that period from 1990 to 94, the years of so-called peace talks, it was one of the most violent periods in the country's entire history. People call it a low-intensity civil war, a war that wasn't fought on some official battlefield, but on commuter trains, inside people's homes, and at funerals. The numbers are just staggering. Somewhere between 14 and 20,000 people were killed in political violence during those 4 years alone. That's more than in the 2 decades before it combined. And these are not just statistics. These are families, communities just ripped apart. And the key thing to understand is this violence wasn't random. People on the ground were saying there was a hidden hand, some dark force pulling the strings, trying to make sure the road to democracy was soaked in blood.
Well, that hidden hand eventually got a name: the Third Force. It was this shadowy network of police, military intelligence, and secret operatives, all working inside de Klerk's own government. And what was their mission? Well, the allegation was to destabilize and weaken the ANC at the negotiating table by secretly arming and supporting its main political rival, the Inkathagate Freedom Party, and basically starting a brutal black-on-black civil war.
Now, for a long time, de Klerk and his government just dismissed this third force idea as propaganda, a conspiracy theory. But then, in 1991, a scandal exploded that blew the whole denial apart. It was called Inkathagate, and it proved that the state wasn't just failing to stop the violence, it was actively pouring gasoline on the fire.
And this strategy was as cynical as it gets. They used these secret, off-the-books government slush funds to funnel cash directly to the IFP. This public money paid for anti-ANC rallies, it set up a rival trade union, it did everything it could to prop up the one political force that was locked in a deadly, bloodied conflict with the ANC. It was a classic divide-and-rule strategy, designed to make sure that if the ANC ever did come to power, it would be bruised, battered, and broken.
And here's the kicker. De Klerk basically admits it himself, right here in his own autobiography. He writes that yes, the government had been helping Inkathagate for years, and that this help continued right into his presidency. Now, he tries to frame it as just supporting an ally against communism, but on the ground, the result was an absolute catastrophe.
Mandela's reaction wasn't just political disagreement. It was the raw, heartbroken anguish of a leader who was watching his people get slaughtered. When he heard about this secret funding, he saw it for what it was. He accused de Klerk of trying to win a political game by standing on the dead bodies of his supporters. At that moment, the trust, the partnership that the whole world was celebrating, it was completely shattered.
So when you're faced with hard evidence that a secret war is being run from inside your own government, what do? Did de Klerk stand up and take full responsibility for the horrors committed on his watch? Well, his record on this is deeply, deeply troubling.
And right here, you can see the huge gap between what he said and what was found. In 1993, de Klerk gave this very careful apology, expressing regret for the misery of apartheid. But South Africa's own Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, they went way further. They found him, as the head of state, politically and morally responsible for the killings, the torture, and all the other gross human rights violations his security forces were carrying out.
And this wasn't just about him looking the other way. In some cases, he was directly involved. In October 1993, de Klerk personally signed off on a military raid on a house in Mthatha. They claimed it was a terrorist hideout. But the raid killed 5 people, all of them civilians. 3 were teenagers, and 2 were just 12 years old. The TRC called it exactly what it was, a gross violation of human rights. And even decades later, this pattern of denial just never really went away. As recently as 2020, he was on TV claiming that the idea of apartheid being a crime against humanity was just Soviet propaganda. The comment caused so much pain and outrage across South Africa that he was forced to apologize. It showed that even at the end of his life, he just couldn't seem to grasp or admit the pure moral evil of the system he once led.
But maybe, just maybe, the most cynical act of his entire time in office came right at the very end, just before he handed over power. Because when it became clear that you couldn't deny the past anymore, well, the next best thing was to simply erase it.
Investigators and historians have a name for this mass destruction of government files. It's a chilling name. They call it a paper Auschwitz. It's a term that really captures the horrifying scale and the moral bankruptcy of a state systematically destroying the evidence of its own crimes.
44 metric tons, just let that sink in for a second. 44 tons of paper. Piles and piles of sensitive records from the president's office, the police, military intelligence, all of it shredded, burned, or pulped in the final days of apartheid. This wasn't some spring cleaning. This was a massive, coordinated campaign to make sure the darkest secrets of the regime were buried forever.
And there was no doubt about the motive. The TRC was crystal clear. This was done for one reason: to hide incriminating evidence, to protect killers and torturers from ever facing justice, and, this is the most damning part, to sanitize history, to literally rewrite the story of apartheid by burning the ugliest chapters.
So a peaceful transition did happen. A civil war was, in the end, averted. But what was the real price of that peace? What's the lasting damage from this legacy of violence, of denial, and of secrets?
Well, that cost is still being paid today. For thousands and thousands of families, the destruction of those records means they will never, ever know the truth about what happened to their parents, their siblings, their children. For the country, it meant trying to build a new democracy on a foundation of lies and secrets, which created a deep distrust in government that's still there. The full, honest story of how South Africa became a democracy is now permanently lost.
F.W. de Klerk did oversee the end of apartheid. That is a historic fact. But he also oversaw a campaign of terror and a massive cover-up that has left South Africa a deeply scarred nation. And it leaves all of us with a really haunting question. What is the true cost of a peace that's built not on truth and justice, but on secrets and lies? It's a question that still haunts a country that, for so many of its people, paid for peace with its own truth.